Minnesota. He received his PhD from Ohio State University in 1979. His research focus has revolved around various aspects of testing and assessment in workplace, military, and educational settings. He's been highly prominent in his field, serving as the founding editor of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, SIOP, their journal, Industrial and Organizational Psychology, Perspectives on Science and Practice, and the editor of Personnel Psychology. He served as president of SIOP and co-chair of the Joint Committee on Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing, among other such service activities. He's received many awards for teaching, for research, and for service, including a Lifetime Service Award from the National Academy of Sciences. He's the only person to receive Lifetime Achievement Awards in the 3 domains of teaching, research, and service from SIOP. And he's been awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Ghent, by Ghent University in Belgium. So today he'll talk to us about new developments in stereotype threat, implications for high stakes testing.
Okay, thank you. Happy to be here. And I think consistent with what's been said, please feel free to interrupt. I'm unsure whether there's things that I will say or terminology I use that's routine in my field and is puzzling to some in the audience. So I can be as casual as we need and happy to clarify whenever needed. Okay, so I was invited to speak to you today about work in the domain of stereotype threat, and so that's what I am doing here. To set the stage, as you heard from the intro, I'm a guy who spent 40 plus years studying what we call high stakes testing, tests used for important decisions. Do you get the job? Are you admitted to the prestigious university? Are you allowed into the military, into the specific specialty you want to get into? So tests of the sort that are used for decisions are what I study, with a particular interest in issues of fairness and bias, and asking whether assessment devices work as intended and work comparably, regardless of the group of people who are being assessed. So that said, I'm always monitoring the environment, looking for new issues, claims, and one important claim that's arisen is the idea of stereotype threat. And so we'll set it up here. The formal definition is a mouthful, and we'll get concrete. So this is, in a situation where a stereotype of a group about which you belong becomes salient, concerns about being judged according to that stereotype arise and inhibit performance. Okay, so that's the theory in a nutshell. And high stakes testing is such a situation. There are stereotypes about women's performance in math. So it's hypothesized that when women enter a testing situation and are asked to take a math test, the stereotype about their group becomes salient, and says the theory, some of your attentional resources will be taken away from focusing on the test itself to being concerned about the stereotype, and thus inhibit performance. Women's performance in math is an example. Stereotypes, common findings about mean differences by subgroup on cognitive tests. So that's the setup. The theory is a broad one. The theory is non-controversial. The idea of stereotype threat makes perfect sense. It's something we experience all the time. I'm a psychologist. My wife is a PhD chemist. When I go with her to a chemistry party, on the way, I find myself anticipating the exchanges that may take place at that event. There's, oh, you're Pat's husband. What do you do? Oh, I'm a psychologist. Oh, you're a soft scientist, not a real scientist. I am worried that there's a stereotype about me. That's the concept of stereotype threat. So the idea is real and applies all over the place. The question is whether it does indeed translate, as hypothesized here, to high stakes testing situations. Okay. Now I'm jumping the gun. This is sort of a current state of affairs, and this is something that I'm reacting against, and I want to challenge what's being stated here. There's a challenge to the use of admissions tests at the University of Texas. This is a case that found its way to the Supreme Court. And a group of social psychologists, the group that are heavily involved in doing stereotype threat work, submitted a brief to the court. And so here's their key thing. Stereotype threat, extensively studied over a couple decades, hundreds of studies. We've confirmed the existence, measured its magnitude, both in the lab and real world. Standard assessments of academic performance underestimate the ability of students targeted by negative stereotypes. They even quantify it here, 0.18 standard deviations or 62 points on the SAT. So here's this assertion to the Supreme Court that it's well established, it's known, tests are biased. So that's a strong statement. And what I'm going to do today is review the research that's the basis for the conclusions drawn in that brief and critically evaluate it. Okay. We're going to start at the beginning. The original stereotype threat paradigm, the seminal study is Steele and Aronson, 1995. And they're going to induce threat by manipulation. They're going to bring students into a laboratory and randomly assign them to one of two conditions. One, they're told the test you're about to take is a test of intelligence. The other is told they're going to take the same test. What you're about to take is a problem-solving task developed in our laboratory. Okay, so you're invoking the stereotype by specifying intelligence for which there are known stereotypes about group differences, and then an innocuous problem. You administer the test, compare the threat, non-threat groups, better minority group performance in the non-threat condition. So this paradigm has been used in literally hundreds of studies in different ways, shapes, and forms. Create threat and non-threat conditions, randomly assign people to one or the other, see what happens. Okay. Here is a graph from Steele and Aronson. This is widely reproduced. You'll find it frequently in introductory psychology textbooks, for example. So this sort of tells the story. And this is something I'm going to devote a few minutes to, a good amount of attention to, because it proves important and perhaps less obvious than it seems. What you see is, okay, here's black and white college students in threat and non-threat conditions. The y-axis is labeled mean items solved, parentheses adjusted by SAT. And you see, a big difference in the threat condition and trivial no difference in the non-threat condition. So here's this very vivid visual. And so, here's some examples of how this is categorized. I'll put students in a situation where they're not threatened. And under those circumstances, Blacks do just as well as whites and Asians. That's Walter Massey was head of the NSF at the time he made that statement. Here's another illustration. African-American and white students told it will provide a measure of their intellectual ability. Importantly, if not told that it's about intellectual ability, African-American students perform just as well as white students. This is Richard McCarty, at the time the head of the science directorate at the American Psychological Association. I'm going out of my way to pick on prominent people to say it's not a case of, this is what many people are saying, how they're describing the study that I've been outlining for you. I want to take us back to that graph one more time. There is a key feature that appears to be fundamentally misunderstood, which is the y-axis, which says mean item solved adjusted by SAT. So we're doing a statistical adjustment and a statistical control for a prior SAT, the test that students took before entering college and before participating in this experiment. And my proposition here is many people appear not to understand the concept of what statistical control means, or at least what it means in this situation. Here's what I think people think it means. We say, oh, it's adjusted by SAT. Oh yeah, they took a, let's call that a pretest. They took the SAT before coming into college, and you know, there's the common finding of lower mean test scores for college applicants on the SAT for Black students than white. So we've got the pre-existing difference. When we bring them into the lab and give them a test under threatening conditions, we reproduce that, that difference. When we eliminate threat by presenting it as an innocuous test, the difference goes away. That's what I believe people think it means. It doesn't mean that. What it really means, and this is the concept of statistical control, holding a prior test score constant, effectively, among people with a comparable pretest or SAT score, what happens? So with statistical control, the real scenario is we've controlled such that there are no differences on the pretest. We can create them in the laboratory by invoking threat. In a non-threat condition, we return to the no difference baseline. A radically different finding. This notion that test score needs to be adjusted, the meaning of adjusted by SAT. So if one understands the fundamentals of statistical control, this should be straightforward, but I think it's just not understood by many. One of my favorites is an introductory psychology textbook that reproduces the graph, except they drop the adjusted by SAT, apparently based on some notion that that's just unneeded complexity. So they just present it as number correct. Okay.
Paul, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Is it possible to get the difference to go the other way by offering selective encouragement? Or to tell, I guess the idea is.
I will get to something like that. There's some findings that I'll get to in a bit. So the idea is a key one. Let me get there.
Okay.
But for now, the phenomenon that got all this attention is, oh, look, we can eliminate differences by simply removing threat from the situation. And that's not, Steele and Aronson did rightly show that threat affects how minority students respond to tests. There's a difference in how they perform in the threat and the non-threat condition. But what they did not show is that it eliminates the difference between groups, that misinterpretation due to not understanding that one has controlled away statistically the pretest differences. The study shows you can create group differences scores above and beyond the difference on the SAT. Okay, we explained this in an American Psychologist article, which would be the most prominent journal in our field quite a number of years ago, a couple of colleagues. It's that explanation didn't help. I was a little dismayed. Just recently with a student revisited it. We found 94 articles since we wrote that American Psychologist piece that described the Steele and Aronson findings, and 62% of them still get it wrong. I give you a quote here, which would look like the quotes you've seen before. African-American students perform as well as European-American students, but when you put them in the threat condition, it depresses their score. So this notion that we can eliminate this long-standing, very troubling mean difference which we see on admission test scores, employment test scores, military entry scores, simply by a changing, the instructional set under which someone takes the test. It would be tremendously appealing if it were true, but that study doesn't show it, is the gist of what I was trying to say there.
We have a question from Professor Stephen White, who I will, Steve, can you unmute yourself?
Trying now, got it.
Great.
Okay, so the other thing that struck me from this particular chart was the magnitude of the difference in the number of correct scores. I could, if as someone who writes tests, I could say, well, this is like 90% versus 50%, this is the difference between an A and an F. And just the magnitude strikes me as sort of implausible unless this threat was somehow overt and severe. So can you comment on that?
Yeah. And you've hit on something that will also be a major theme as I progress. How severe is the threat? And what I will eventually show you is that across the hundreds of studies of this, the severity of the threat varies substantially and turns out to have a big effect on the findings. So that's a good question, and we'll get to it here. And again, I mean, they've made up a test given their lab, and so it's just mean number of items correct. In this study, it's a pretty good sized effect. There's no question of that. But I call this a proof of concept study. They're in a laboratory setting asking, can one get an effect? And we're going to later want to ask what's likely to be seen in operational settings. Okay, if that works, where was I? I was here. Oh, okay, now a large body of work exists. I want to make a key distinction. There are two separate literatures out there these days, maybe more, but two that I want to call your attention to. The first is what I've been talking about, the effect of threat on scores on tests in the cognitive domain, educational admissions test, employment test, military entry tests. There is another body of work, the effect of threat on subsequent learning. The notion of students in a classroom setting are in an environment they see as threatening. If you can lower that threat, do students acquire knowledge better moving forward? Both are really interesting, but both are really different. I mean, the issue here with the threat on cognitive tests is a question of, is threat preventing you from demonstrating knowledge and skill you've already acquired? And the second is threat interfering with learning in the future? Findings in one domain don't per se inform us about the other. They're two interesting ones. So people say, oh, that work on the effect of threat on subsequent learning says it's real, and therefore we can draw conclusions about effects on admissions tests. I'd say no. So okay, threat may operate differently in some settings than others. Removing it in the learning environment might improve it, but that's not evidence that threat bias is a test. Okay. Various stereotypes have been studied: race, gender, age, various ways of manipulating it, from very explicit to very subtle. Explicit would state something like, women on average score lower than men on math tests like this. Effectively, you are a member of a group that doesn't do well on this test. That will be a very explicit statement. And at the other end, very, very subtle. So that the concept of priming, so the notion of, so there's laboratory work that says just priming a category, simply asking people to report their race or gender just before they start taking a test can produce an effect. The notion of just by being asked to mark a checkbox about race or gender makes you think about race and gender, makes you aware of the stereotype, and appears to influence performance. So this explicit to subtle continuum exists, and I will show you work that explores its effect.
Paul, Professor Kirill Stengel actually still wants to. Kirill, why don't you just speak up? Kirill, can you hear me? Can you unmute yourself? No? What happened to?
I'll keep going and we'll see what
Oh
happens.
yeah, okay. Now I can unmute myself. So I just wanted to make sure I understand what you said before, because it appears to me that whether you how exactly you adjust for the pre-test SAT scores should depend on whether you treat the SAT exam itself as the exam that is where the threat is present or not. And so, you know, as I mentioned in my message in the chat, I actually don't know very much about the mechanics of the SAT. I haven't, you know, I haven't grown up in this country. But I mean, shouldn't that be a very important consideration of how you do statistics? And anyway, I just want to make sure I understand that.
Yeah, I mean, the mechanics of the adjustment are straightforward. It just says among people with the same pre-test score, what happens when we bring them into the lab.
Right, but the pre-test scores are the SAT scores, and if you assume that that test is also given under the threat conditions, that I mean, so I think it's a very important piece of information whether or not the SAT exam is something that you perceive as a measure of what happens in the absence of the threat conditions or in the presence of the threat conditions. And
I'm going to say that's a good insight, and ask you again to stick with me a little bit. There's some stuff I want to spool out that I hope will get at some of these things. So I'll agree. It's
maybe I can just say one thing. I think that the thing we were supposed to take away was simply that relative to the SAT scores, what those experiments accomplished, and we can obviously the overall philosophical claim is that everything is explained by stereotype threat with respect to natality or some other condition. But I think you wanted us to take away that happened in the experiment, right?
The takeaway is if there were pick a number, if there were a 30-point gap on prior SAT, there remains a 30-point gap on performance on their laboratory task in the non-threat condition. So rather than saying we've gotten rid of it, we're saying it's staying proportionally the same. So that's the key idea. So it's challenging the notion that there's a quick and easy fix that makes the difference go away. Okay, continuing on. A couple of former students of mine done a meta-analysis of studies. They found 116 studies, 115 of them are in laboratory settings. So it's an issue here is I would be happier if I saw more people looking at this in operational settings rather than in laboratory settings. On average, the stereotype group does do better in a safe condition than in a threatening condition. On average, about 1/4 of a standard deviation. The effect is fragile. The larger the sample, the smaller the effect, and that's going to prove important because we don't want to see that. I mean, that's got some interesting implications. Big question, does it generalize to operational settings? It's really hard to replicate this in a high stakes setting. One cannot do a direct transfer of Steele and Aronson's experiment to a real setting. You can't tell real job applicants or real candidates for educational admission that the test they're taking is an innocuous thing. They know what it is. So it's very hard to do this kind of experimentation. We've argued that there are some techniques and tools used in the tests and measurement field that can be used to test predictions derived from stereotype threat theory. A phenomenon we call differential prediction. This is how testing specialists examine tests for bias. What we do is we look at the regression line relating scores on a test to the outcome of interest. SAT scores predicting grades. Employment tests predicting job performance. What one would love to see is here's the regression line relating test scores to performance. If it's a good test, the higher the test score, the higher the subsequent performance. And we would like to see a comparable line for both our majority and minority group. If threat were operating, what should we see? It would lower the scores of minority groups, shifting the line to the left. Okay, so there's a prediction of what one should see if threat were operating. We expect to see a different pattern when threat's present than when threat's absent if threat has a real effect on test scores. So we're looking at the relationship between SAT and grades by race and gender. This looking at regression lines requires that the outcome measure, what I call the criterion, has to be unbiased. Stereotype threat couldn't also affect performance on the criterion. And we thought we had a clever way to do that. So we're looking at a gender difference here. So conceptually, stereotype threat could affect female performance in math classes the same way it affects performance on SAT math. Our solution, I'm going to use SAT math to predict grades in math courses and to predict grades in English courses. That sounds odd. Why would you use math to predict English? Turns out to predict pretty well. But there's be no basis for positing that threat would affect how women perform in the domain of English. So we've got an unbiased criterion. And the punchline is if I've got SAT math or SAT verbal, a threatening test or a safe test, the outcome is performance in English grades. The pattern is exactly the same. One doesn't see difference in the pattern of findings with math that one should see should threat be operating. Now, this is maybe pretty subtle, pretty nuanced, but the notion is what can we do for gathering data in a setting where you can't really do the experiment that you can do in the lab. So finding a comparable pattern in a setting where threat shouldn't operate and should operate argues against threat findings. Okay. Threat theory says the effect should be larger for higher scores than lower. We don't find evidence of that. Folks in the stereotype threat domain have said we will discount this. It's an observational study. It's not a true experiment. And I find that frustrating. It's true, it's not a true experiment, but it's very hard to do true experiments I've just outlined. But it turns out that there are a few. There have been several settings where people in a creative and innovative way have managed to do a true experiment on stereotype threat in an operational setting. Stricker and Ward, these are researchers with ETS, the people, the college admissions tests folks. Because of this work that I mentioned that simply asking people to mark their race or gender before taking a test produces threat effects in the lab, they said, this is really interesting. ETS tests millions of students a year. They collect race and gender information just for research purposes. And sometimes they collect it before, sometimes after. They've never thought of it as an issue. But now that it surfaces as the assertion that collecting it before a test can produce these threat effects, well, okay, let's just randomly assign people to do it either before or after and see what happens. So that's what they did. In the lab, there's notions that the race of the person administering the test is enough to induce a threat effect. Well, okay, again, ETS researchers, we can look at the race of proctors at our test centers and see if that has an effect in this setting. Also in the laboratory, there's evidence for what's called a spillover test. When you take an SAT, there's multiple sections, an English section, a math, another English, a handful of different sections. Spillover says scores on your English SAT will be lower for women if it comes after a math section, which is purportedly threatening, than if it comes after an English section. Now that's been done in the lab and effects have been shown. And now all of these, which would be really large sample, tens if not hundreds of thousands of students, don't find evidence of these effects. So the work to date has not been finding these effects in operational settings. I want to address an argument that counters what I've just said. To social psychologists, come up with very precise estimates. Stereotype Threat has denied 4,763 women of credit in advanced placement calculus. How did that reach that conclusion? The study I've just described, Stricker and Ward, where you report your gender either before or after you take a test. And they said, no, look, for AP calculus, women do better when the gender query came after the test. In other words, if it's before, their test score is lowered. Stricker and Ward had posited convention in our field, 0.2 as a minimum threshold. Below that, it's viewed as essentially ignorable. They say 17, it's not 0, it's below 20, but given how important this domain is, we should be interested in even very small effects. So here's the claim. Multiply through a D of 0.7, the number of people taking AP calculus nationwide, and you get 4,763 people who would be wrongly denied. And this has become a go-to citation to refute claims that stereotype threat doesn't generalize to the field.
Actually, Paul, I'm not sure I understood those numbers. What is D? What is 0.17?
I'm sorry. Yeah, here's where I'm doing something. D is, it's routine for us. It's the standardized mean difference. The mean score in the threatening condition minus the mean score in a non-threatening condition expressed in standard deviation units. So a D just means 0.17 standard deviation units lower. So yeah, that's important
sigma effect.
because I'm going to toss D out left and right over the next 15 minutes or so.
Right. Okay.
A colleague and I said, hold on a minute. That Stricker and Ward study that they're referring to looked at 3 different tests: AP calculus, algebra, arithmetic. They're all math tests where threat theory would posit a gender effect. The folks revisiting it singled out AP calculus, where you get the women are harmed by 0.17 units. But on algebra, women checking the gender box are aided by 0.15 units. In arithmetic, it's effectively 0. Basically, these are small effects fluctuating around 0 in either direction. We argue against cherry picking and saying, ooh, this one looks like threat, when there's another one that goes exactly the opposite. You see variability in strength and direction. If you wanted to say, pick whichever one you like, well, you'd reach the opposite conclusion by picking a different test. So when I look at the totality, when we average across the 3 tests, it's hard to make an argument that threat effect scores in any predictable way. Now, what I want to focus on, because it's new and I'm excited by it, is a new meta-analysis. So 2 students of mine looking at the current state of the literature. We've got 212 threat experiments using adult participants. We get an average effect size of, again, our D, 0.32. Threatened groups in this meta-analysis perform 0.3 standard deviations lower than they would in a non-threat condition. So across hundreds of studies, there is on average a reasonably meaningful effect, okay? But given my interests are in differences between experimental settings and operational settings, we identified 3 features that would not be present in operational settings, and we're going to systematically examine the effect of those features on study findings. I'm going to run through this. Feature 1, test scoring. Most score a test in a very traditional way. Count up the number right. You took 100 items, you got 86 of them correct. A subset of studies use a metric, proportion correct among items attempted. In other words, if you've left it blank, it's dropped. If it was a 100-item test, if you left 50 items blank and you got 30 right, you compute it as 30 out of 50 rather than 30 out of 100. Now, this could never be done in an operational setting. It's easily coached. It takes me 10 seconds. Just tell a student, unless you're certain of the answer, leave it blank. It won't count against you. That's why no one would ever score a test that way. And it turns out if you get big effects, bigger threat effects with this proportion correct scoring than with a number right. So we'll stack that up as one concern. Feature 2, control group versus threat removal. 60% of studies look like Steele and Aronson. There's a threatened group and a control, an innocuous, no threat condition. 40% compare a threat group with what we'll term here a threat removal group, which to me links to a question that was asked earlier. Rather than saying in one condition, hey, this is where people like you don't do well, comparing that with it's innocuous, instead compare that with an explicit statement, there are no group differences on the test you're about to take. You tell them, don't worry about threat, it's not an issue here. So threat versus threat removal. Now, again, you couldn't do that threat removal in any operational setting. If there are mean differences on a test, you can't tell real test takers that there aren't any. I mean, it would be, we can't lie to a test taker. And it proves consequential again. With a control group, affects 28. In a threat removal group, it's larger at 40. Third feature, I've mentioned this before, the subtle versus blatant threat. The most common is to use a blatant threat manipulation, telling the test taker that there are mean differences on the test they're about to take. In other words, you're a member of a group that on average doesn't do well on this test, okay? 35, this more subtle threat manipulation. We've given examples of that. Priming, asking you to report, self-report race or gender before the test. Again, you would never use a blatant manipulation in an operational setting. No one would ever say to a job candidate or someone taking a admissions test, hey, this test doesn't, people in the group to which you belong on average to perform less well. One would never do that. If threat exists in operational settings, it's via these subtle manipulations. In blatant, you get a 42, and in a subtle, you get a 16. In other words, much bigger in blatant. One additional issue we come across, a computational error, and maybe just trust me on this, I'll run through it, but as we mentioned, a subset of studies control statistically for scores on a prior test. That's okay to do that as long as you interpret it correctly. Such control increases statistical power of a test. It reduces standard error. It's not a problem for significance testing. It turns out when you're computing this D statistic and effect size, it's incorrect to use an adjusted standard deviation. So this is a technical point, but using this will artificially increase your effect size. So there's a set of studies that made that computational error. The studies that do statistically control get a 51, those that don't get a 31. I put all of this together and I find out of started with 212, we found 43 that don't fall into any of these troublesome features. They all contain features that are plausible in operational testing settings. So in contrast with the 32, in those settings with features plausible in operational settings, we get 14. So a markedly smaller effect in settings with features that one could find in an operational setting. One additional issue that-
Paul, I think Dan had an earlier question. I was looking for a break, but maybe I let him.
I'm just trying to make sure I get through a lot of stuff. So I'm
I'd like to understand something, since this seems an important, concept. That's your little d, the standardized mean difference. You have two distributions. You compute the mean of one, let's say that under threat conditions, the mean of another under non-threat conditions. Then you say you divide by the standard deviation, but which standard deviation?
A pooled standard deviation.
And how do you compute a pooled standard deviation?
So a pooled standard is standard deviation in each group and simply combined. The assumption is both standard deviations are estimates of the same population parameter. So you have two estimates of the one. There are, getting into the weeds, there are arguments that one should use the control group standard deviation. We compute it both ways, and it turns out in this setting not to matter. But yes, it is a standard deviation within group rather than a total standard deviation across the pool distribution.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay. One issue, and this one is what worries me a lot. Test motivation strikes me as very important. In laboratory studies, there's little incentive to exert full effort. Commonly, these are college students. They're getting extra course credit for participating in an experiment, and they're getting their extra points just for being there. If you show up and say, I don't know what this experiment's going to be about, and you sort of, you better make a judgment. Is this interesting? Should I invest my time and effort or not? My fear is that being put in a threatening situation leads participants to, well, let me just, this isn't interesting. Why would I put time and effort into something where you're telling me people like me don't do well? So I worry about limited motivation, restricted motivation, limited effort. What I find interesting is a subset of studies offer a financial incentive to perform well on the test in the laboratory, as sort of an analogy to trying to motivate, sort of to come closer to a job applicant setting. You really want the job. You're in a lab. Well, there's nothing you really want, but you could get $5 extra if you meet some performance standard. With an incentive, you get a -14. Without an incentive, a -41. So this motivation seems to matter a lot. So my fear that without a reason to be exerting effort, students put in a threatening situation say, this is threatening. I don't like it. I will complete this as quickly as I can, something like that. So incentive turns out to matter. So we start out, let me stop here for a second. So we started with an on average a pretty good sized effect, 32, much smaller in settings with features that are plausible, much smaller in settings where there is an incentive. And I want to add an additional issue. This is something that's become a big deal in psychology, which is concern about publication bias. The question is, are we seeing all the studies that are done, or are we seeing a suppression of findings that aren't supportive of a researcher's initial hypothesis? So there's several lines of evidence I'm going to put forward. One, we see bigger effects in small sample studies. So if I take all the studies and order them from the biggest to the smallest, the average D in the 10 largest studies is 0.07. When by the time you get to all of them, we got our 0.32. There is a technique in our field we call trim and fill analysis. Let's assume that the true state of affairs is that there is an effect, pick any domain, that a true effect is 30. If you do a whole bunch of studies, you're not going to get 30 in every study. This is sampling error. This is simple statistical theory. And one would expect to see a symmetric distribution. Sampling error can hurt you or harm you with equal probability. So if the true effect is 30, we're just as likely to get a 35 by sampling error as a 25 by sampling error, right? So we expect a symmetric distribution. That insight says when you see departures from symmetry, it suggests that studies that produce findings that either the author doesn't care for, or the author tried to but wasn't successful in getting published because the editor and reviewers are biased against studies that don't confirm a hypothesis. So departures from symmetry suggest what we call publication bias. There are techniques for correcting for asymmetry that gets that 0.32 down to 0.09. And there's a third, again, we're coming at this from different angles, a new set of techniques called a test for excess significance. And again, this is using statistical theory that says a given study has a certain level of statistical power. Are we getting more significant findings than one would expect to get given the sample sizes used in the study? So these three things all come together to suggest publication bias, such that studies that don't get the threat effect don't see the light of day. So correcting for publication bias. Oh, here's just a nifty little chart. And this is a standard technique we're using these days, where at the top is the effect from the single largest study. The second row is the average effect across the two largest studies, then the average across the three largest, 4, 5, 6, down through the whole thing. And this is just this nice illustration. The big studies give you very small effects. And as we add the small sample studies, we get into the finding of larger effects. So to me, the bottom line, I see weak evidence of a threat effect. Overall, good-sized. Studies with features that are plausible, much smaller. Correcting for publication bias reduces it further, not significantly different from 0. The 4 true experiments give you a mean D of 0.01. To me, I'm not convinced. Now, what if any implications?
Right. Can I ask you one quick question? So you were talking about the size of the shift induced by the threat condition. To make sense of this, now the existing difference, let's say in the cases of interest, let's say whites and blacks and men and women, just to take 2 examples. So if I remember right from the SAT, something the white-black difference is about a standard deviation. I think, and the male-female one is smaller. So one should be comparing this to.
Right. All of the comparisons, when I'm saying a D here, all of these, this is the difference between how a minority group, a threatened group, performs in a threatening versus non-threatening condition.
Right. But does it matter which minority group it is?
In group comparison. So we're saying, this would say black students on average in these experimental settings score 0.32 standard deviations lower in a threatening condition than they do in a control condition.
But is the stereotype threat difference same for, let's say, black, white versus men, women?
Yeah, we find this, the set of studies that we're talking about here are, the 212 are combining race studies and gender studies. They're broken down in subgroup analyses. The finding is, and magnitudes are analogous in the two. Yeah. So again, the notion of the degree to which a minority student's performance is lowered by threat, much smaller in studies with these features, plausible in operational settings, smaller when there's a motivation to exert effort, and smaller when publication bias is taken into account, and very small in true experiments. So I'm seeing a pattern of evidence that's not leading me to say there is a systematic bias in operational settings. I think I'm going to skip a couple. Well, I'll try to do this really, really quick. Just a couple things left. What might a testing program do? What I'm going to show you is, okay, here. We did a little collection of all the suggestions in the literature about what testing programs should do, and we're gonna comment. Let me just comment. Let me get the whole thing up. Might as well have it all here at once. So some say, tell test takers that the thing that we're measuring is malleable, changeable, it's not fixed. Sure, that's fine. Show diverse role models in pretest materials. Sure, that's right. Use less charged labels. I think people do. We don't see people giving admissions tests or employment tests and giving them labels other than this is, my goodness, the SAT doesn't even stand for anything anymore. It is just the SAT. It's not even an acronym. Provide a positive and encouraging test environment. Great. Other suggestions, as I've already hinted, do not make sense. We could not tell a test taker the stereotype is incorrect. We can't give misinformation. We can't tell someone the test that is in fact a high stakes test. We can't tell them it's innocuous. There's other suggestions that may or may not make sense. There's suggestions you should test everyone in a same group environment. Women only take the test surrounded by other women, etc. We can debate that, and it's less of an issue as more and more people are taking tests alone, online, So the setting and being surrounded by other people becoming less and less of an issue. Does it make sense to teach test takers about stereotype threat? Maybe there's suggestions you should provide people, teach them to positive self-affirmations. I'm okay, I can do this before the test. I don't know. So that's the kind of suggestions for a testing program, and many of them make sense regardless of whether the research findings are supportive. But what I see is that strong conclusion in the amicus brief to the Supreme Court is not warranted. The research clearly shows that in a lab setting, we can influence test scores by various manipulations. The question, does it systematically affect test scores in high stake settings, is the question we're really interested in. Research in operational settings is very limited. The preponderance isn't supportive. To me, I'd say the case for threat effects has not been made to date. I guess I'm just being very conservative here rather than saying threat doesn't affect test scores. I see from what I see, I think the case that says there is a big threat effect is not supported by the body of data that I've been showing you today. So that's my set of slides.
Great. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do first is stop recording, and then we will wait, actually, there's a hand up, so maybe I'm going to ask Professor Steve White to unmute himself and ask his question.
Oh, there we go. So you can stop recording. This was meant to just ask a question for the final part, not a clarification of the immediate.
Oh, okay, all right. In that case, let me start.
Recording if you want.
Yeah, let me do